Greetings, friends. In this video, I wanted to give a response to this idea on the right that within the right, those of us who speak favorably of Russia, who seem to agree with the Russian position and the Russian justification for their war in Ukraine, that we are holding an unreasonable, fantastical view of Russia as this amazing Orthodox-based Christian empire that's going to return basedness to the world. And perhaps that is the case with some young men who buy into that sort of simplistic worldview. But I don't think that's a fair assessment for all of us, not myself. That's not my view of Russia. I don't believe it to be the based empire that's going to save the earth. I've never been to Russia. I don't have Russian heritage. My grandfather fought against the Soviets, but I sympathize with the Russian position and Russian culture because I attend a ROKOR church, Russian Orthodox church outside Russia in Toronto, which happens to be the largest ROKOR church congregation in North America. Even in the United States, even in New York, where their headquarters is, it's not as big as it is here. And that's just been an incredible blessing. And there's many other Eastern Europeans there and a few people from completely different countries as well, but it tends to be, of course, a majority Russian and Ukrainian, although Ukrainians who are sympathetic to Russia, that sort of that milieu of people. So that's my only exposure to Russia. I would love to eventually learn the language, and it's a beautiful, rich culture and civilization, obviously. And being Orthodox, I see them taking a leadership role in preserving holy orthodoxy in the world. There's many pious people in Greece. Greece has a very important place in the history of orthodoxy spreading through the world. But obviously now Greece is in crisis. And we see that Bartholomew in Constantinople is obviously not following traditional orthodoxy. So there's many problems within Orthodoxy, but we see Russia and its Orthodox Church and outside Russia taking a leadership role. So this is another reason I sympathize with Russia. But of course, my first allegiance has to be to Canada. I'm Canadian. That's my home country. But I believe in a world where we can get along with Russia. We can have peace with Russia. We can have peace with the United States. We don't have to be antagonizing one or other. I believe in that possibility. But the US their empire has to be checked. And hopefully they don't just channel it into China and try to start a war with China. Because Russia's just, they're deflecting the energy successfully away from them, but the empire hasn't fallen. It's still kicking, so it has to keep expanding somehow. So they want to push down barriers wherever they can. But anyways, it's naive to think that Russia's this huge, strong force because, that would threaten Europe, that's going to threaten Poland and conquer the Baltics and then conquer the rest of Europe. No, actually in history it went the other way. It went from France, like Napoleon trying to conquer Russia, and then Hitler trying to conquer Russia. So history shows the opposite. Well, actually, no, that's not entirely true, because then the Russians came back and conquered half of Europe. So I understand. People who live in these regions like Latvia, Finland, of course, who have fought the Russians, they have legitimate reasons to be definitely very suspicious of Russian intentions. I totally understand that. That makes sense. But in the situation of Ukraine, we have an enormous country, Ukraine, invaded by the biggest country in the world in terms of territory. But that's not a war that could be resolved quickly because of such a large territory and so many numbers of men involved. But Russia, against all odds, was the underdog, not against Ukraine isolated, but against the collective West, as it may be called. They were the underdog. Economically, everyone thought they were going to be crushed by the sanctions. That didn't work. Sanctions after sanctions after sanctions have not destroyed their economy. They've had challenges, of course, but it hasn't fallen. In fact, their economy has grown. They found other people to buy their oil and gas, and they have stronger relations with China and India and other countries. So it's really just the Anglosphere and the West and Europe that is set against them. But they were still the underdog in that economic sense, that they overcame the sanctions war. And they were the underdog also, I'd say, militarily, that people assume that, oh, they're just a primitive country, they won't be able to really win this war, and they're fighting with shovels, and they're fighting with microchips from washing machines because they can't produce the microchips. They have to use North Korean soldiers, even though we've never seen any verified photographic evidence of any of these North Koreans. They just don't talk about it anymore. They've vindicated themselves, being the underdog in many ways. I mean, you can see them as this big, bad, totalitarian force crushing poor little Ukraine, but poor little Ukraine is using hundreds of billions of dollars from the US and other countries. It's a proxy war, primarily by the United States against Russia, to break up Russia, but also France and Britain are heavily set against Russia. Maybe Germany to an extent too, but Germany's a bit smarter because they're closer to Russia. But they went along with it too. They all went along with the direction the Americans had previously taken before trying to turn it down and settle a peace these days. The basic point I was trying to get at is there's no real threat of Russia invading even Western Ukraine. They're not even going to do that. They have said as much. It would be militarily a huge headache after 3 years of war already. And politically, it would be unviable. Those people don't want to be governed by Russia. That's not what they want. Why would Russia want to incorporate them? Why would Russia want to incorporate Poland into the Federation of Russia? That's insane. The Poles would put up a huge fight. It would be a bitter war. Now, maybe they could occupy the Baltics without much of a fight because there's no one in the Baltics. But why? Why? For what purpose? Why would they need to do that? They didn't even need to invade Ukraine. They could have all been settled diplomatically long ago. But they were literally threatened. And many people don't believe that Russia was actually at threat of being militarily targeted by missiles or by the threat of regime change. They certainly want regime change. But that idea of politically removing that regime and then moving to break up the world's largest country, because it is the world's largest country by area, break it up to smaller regions. You can get the billionaires to come back in, your local guys, and then you can exploit all of those natural resources. So no, Russia's not like this super religious country. It's not majority Christian or majority Orthodox. There's a number of Muslims there. There's a number of diverse elements because it's such a large territory. It includes Asiatic peoples. But it's far more white than anything we would see in the West. It's far more Christian than anything we would see in the West. Because even though it's not majority Orthodox, it has a significant minority of Orthodox Christians, and that number is growing steadily. It survived communism. It survived the official atheism of the Soviet Union, whereas Christianity has fallen significantly in the West with Protestantism. So that's not to think that it's this huge based Orthodox empire that's going to convert the whole world to Orthodoxy, but we see leadership. We see a country willing to stand up to these pigs, these globalists, and actually fight them. And when Putin began his invasion, this was right as the trucker protest in Ottawa against the stabby mandates by the Canadian government was at its climax. That was around the time the Canadian government was literally going to send in military elements to forcefully clear the protesters. Then Putin began his invasion. You're at the prison yard and the bullies are kicking all of your group. They're kicking you and they're laughing at you. These pigs, they love to do it all the time and they're fleecing you for your money and everything. Finally, one guy snaps and he fights back. He gives the bully a bloody nose. And he knocks the bully over and he starts kicking the bully in the head. The bully could probably still crush him. He's been taken off guard. He wasn't expecting that. I associated like the global American empire and their proxy in Ukraine with Trudeau. Maybe that's the wrong association because you could say, well, Russia does the same globalist policies. They did COVID as well. I mean, yeah, kind of. But some bastard in the world finally stood up to these pigs and was willing to kick them in the face. God help them. Like, that was just my reaction to it. I'm not saying that's the right reaction. I'm not saying that that's fully logical. But that's kind of how I saw it at the time. But I'm not naive about Russia because, it's like if Russia ever conquered Canada, I mean, we wouldn't want that either, but I don't think that's realistic to ever expect. There's no invasion coming from the Arctic from the Russians or the Chinese. Whatever the Trump and his people are telling you about, Canada needs security and we're protecting you. The U.S. is protecting, I mean, in some sense they're protecting trade routes, yes, but there's no Chinese army going to come try to invade North America. They have enough mass immigration. That's their invasion, okay? Mass immigration is the real invasion. But there's no military invasion coming across the Arctic from Russia or China or North Korea or Iran or anything like that. That's not happening. We know that's not happening. It's geographically unrealistic to conceive of such a thing. So Russia's not that strong. Like, they're strong. They've shown themselves to be far stronger than they were thought. They were mocked as being like a gas station masquerading as a country. They were mocked for being that, but they're not. They have a world-class army now, but they're still behind China. China has the largest army in the world. But they've shown themselves to be a legitimate rival of the United States. The United States still has larger economic power and probably still a larger military, although that's questionable. They seem to not be able to match the munitions production of the Russian military anywhere close. So the US has fallen behind in that regard. But it's not like Russia could realistically start to conquer Europe militarily. That would be a huge headache for them. Why would they want to do that? Putin does want peace at some point. He wants to reestablish peace with Europe and the West. Yes, and Russians want that too, at some point. And politically, even if they could conquer these countries, it would just be such a headache. It would be such a mess. This is not the Soviet Union. Those days are done. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm just a guy on the internet, but I don't see that happening. I don't think it's realistic to see that happening. Even in taking more Ukrainian territory, some people are saying, well, they just want to have enough territory that Ukrainian drones won't be able to hit Moscow or hit Russian cities. That requires moving the front line further into Ukraine by some dozens of kilometers or more. It's like, okay, maybe, but technology could always change in the future where now the drones can shoot even further. So that seems a bit silly to me as a justification for where the borders need to be drawn. But I'm beginning to doubt that the Russians are actually going to move all the way up to the Dnieper River and conquer all that extra territory. I mean, they may, but the way things are going with the prospect of peace talks, it looks to me like, really? If Zelensky wanted to end this thing and just settle on giving up the oblasts, I think Putin might agree to it. I think he might actually agree to it. Because Putin does show his care for how the rest of the world perceives Russia. He's very mindful of how the rest of the world sees them. And I think he might just accept the peace, but I don't know if it'd be wise. We'll see. I can't predict what's going to happen. And one last point. People criticize Russia for using the language of colonialism and imperialism and sympathizing with the global south against the West. They say, oh, you're just being like the left. Russia's just being like the left. They're just Marxist social justice politics. Well, hold on. It's a different context. Russia's kind of spinning that language around on the West. That's the way you got to see what they're doing there. Yes, they're not entirely correct, of course, but there's some truth in what they're saying. They're not entirely off base if you look at things through their view. People say, oh, well, Russia colonized the world too. They colonized so much of Asia. It's like, yeah, kind of. They did, certainly. But that's not exactly what was going on in the 19th century with the scramble for Africa, for instance, or the South American colonies of Spain or in Portugal. That's not really the same thing. They didn't have that sort of top-down control founding colonies. That wasn't really their style. But yes, of course, they had their own kind of imperialism, obviously. But the thing is, on the right, it's okay to be a fan of the British Empire, or at least to think that the British Empire was a good thing, because we're Canadians, right? The British Empire was central to our identity for a long time, and it still is part of our foundation. But we can recognize that there were good things and bad things, so all I'm saying is Russia's not entirely off base in using this language against the West, because they're doing it consciously, because they know the West has been steeped in this language for decades now. Now they're kind of turning the tables and saying, well, you guys are colonialists, right? And the global South can sympathize with us. And you think that Russia is now against white people because they're willing to form economic associations and share some political sentiment with non-white countries. That's a very immature view. Any country to be successful, any nation to be successful, you'd want to form partnerships around the world and be sensible and work with other peoples, regardless of what race they are. Hasta luego, amigos.